The house stood alone on the edge of the Arizona desert, half swallowed by sand and time, but untouched in the one way that mattered most. Its 3 inhabitants had not aged a single day in over 2 decades. Travelers spoke of them as if they were an old wives' tale, 3 sisters with faces like porcelain and eyes too knowing for their years, who invited strangers in when the sun fell red against the horizon. No one who entered after dusk had ever been seen leaving. Sheriff Elias Morrow first heard the rumors in 1879, 2 years before he dared ride past the house himself. He dismissed the talk at first, chalking it up to superstition in an unforgiving land where faith and fear often blurred. Yet the files he kept in his locked drawer told a different story. Names of drifters, settlers, and miners who vanished along a single stretch of desert road. Always men, always at night, always last seen within miles of the sisters' house. The sisters were known by name in town: Clara, Maeve, and Eleanor Kavanaugh. Orphaned young, they inherited the land from their father, a rancher who had died suddenly and without a body to bury. By all accounts, the Kavanaugh women rarely ventured into town, save for provisions and occasional cloth. Still, there was something unnatural in their appearance, recorded again and again in whispered witness notes that Elias collected. "Too beautiful," one woman wrote. "Too unchanged," said another, recalling how her mother remembered them looking exactly the same 20 years earlier. On his first and only visit, Elias rode alone beneath the blistering sun. The house looked ordinary from a distance, but as he drew closer, he noticed something disquieting. The shutters were freshly painted, the wood polished, the garden impossibly green despite the drought strangling every other acre of land. And when the door opened, the sisters greeted him not like hermits, but like hostesses expecting a guest, each smile rehearsed, each word precise, as if their manners were copied from another time. He asked about the missing men. Their laughter was soft, melodic, unsettling. Clara, the eldest, spoke for them all. "The desert takes what it wants, Sheriff. Surely you know that better than anyone." And yet he felt the way Maeve's eyes lingered on him too long, the way Eleanor's hands twisted a cloth napkin as if wringing something unseen. That night he returned to town with no answers, but the silence of the desert pressed against him in his sleep, and the faces of the Kavanaugh sisters haunted his dreams with an impossible question. Why had they not changed in all these years? The midwife, Mrs. Callahan, had known Clara as a child. She swore the girl had the same skin, the same hair, the same unlined face now as when she was 12. Elias asked her how that could be. Mrs. Callahan only shook her head. "There are bargains older than the church, Sheriff," she said, her voice trembling. "And some women know." The words, the sheriff began to wonder if those words, the ones never written, only whispered in the shadow of rituals long outlawed, might be the key to understanding why every trail of blood and sand led back to the same house. He opened a new file, one he did not share with the town council. At the top, he wrote, "The Sisters, suspected rituals, evidence missing." But evidence would not remain missing for long. One summer evening, a ranch hand named David Fletcher vanished within a mile of the house. His horse returned riderless, eyes wide with terror, its flanks streaked with blood that was not its own. When Elias touched the saddle, his fingers came away wet. The desert wind carried a sound that night, faint yet deliberate, almost like voices chanting beneath the stars. Elias could not say for certain whether it came from the house or from something older, buried in the land itself. But he knew one thing: the sisters were no longer content to let the desert cover their sins. The realization weighed on Elias Morrow like a stone pressing against his chest. He had spent years in law enforcement, and never had he written such a phrase into his own thoughts, never allowed suspicion to feel like certainty. Yet the memory of David Fletcher's abandoned horse, and the streaks of blood upon the saddle left him no choice. Something more deliberate than accident had taken hold in the desert. By dawn, he gathered the fragments of reports he had collected, laying them across his desk in the sheriff's office. Witness accounts, faded notes of gossip, odd mentions in old church records, all pointed back to the Kavanaugh sisters. But pattern alone was not proof. Without proof, the council would call him a fool, or worse, a man looking to stir panic. It was then that a new account reached him. A herder, Ignacio Torres, came into town trembling. He swore that while tending his flock near the ravine, he saw shadows moving unnaturally in the moonlight. 3 figures stood in a circle, their voices rising in unison. The sheep scattered in terror, and Ignacio claimed he could not stop shaking for hours afterward. When Elias pressed him, the herder lowered his eyes and muttered, "They were singing in a tongue I never heard before. Sheriff, I know what prayer sounds like. That was not prayer." Elias wrote it down in his file. His hand trembled as he did so, not from fear alone, but from a dawning awareness. These women were not just avoiding age. They were maintaining it, nurturing it, with something the land itself seemed to recognize. The hook that morning came from the town's doctor, Samuel Keats. He called Elias aside and shared a troubling detail. The blood on Fletcher's saddle, he said, was not just blood. It was laced with some kind of residue, thicker than it should have been, almost like it had been boiled or altered. I can't explain it, but it doesn't belong in any man's veins. That revelation shook Elias to his core. If the sisters were feeding rituals with blood, as the midwife once suggested, then the substance might not even be wholly human anymore. He felt himself standing at the edge of a precipice, staring down into something ancient and unspoken. The sheriff chose to confide in only one ally, Clara Whitfield, the schoolteacher. She was known for her sharp mind and steady nerves, and Elias trusted her more than most. In hushed tones, he told her what he had gathered. To his surprise, she did not laugh nor dismiss him. Instead, her face paled. "My grandmother used to whisper stories of the desert witches," she confessed. "Women who learned to trap the years inside themselves by pouring them out of others. They said the rituals required 3, always 3. Alone, they were powerless. Together, they could live forever." Elias understood then why Clara, Maeve, and Eleanor had never separated, never married, never even courted anyone in town. Their bond was not simply sisterhood, it was survival, and their survival depended on the lives of others. That night, Elias rode again toward the desert house, determination hardening his fear into resolve. He would confront them, or at the very least, watch them with his own eyes. The moon was high, silvering the sand, when he tied his horse to a mesquite tree and crept closer. Through the window, he saw them, 3 figures swaying in candlelight, their shadows enormous on the walls. Their lips moved in rhythm, and in the center of the room lay something draped in cloth, shaped like a body. His breath caught, the chanting grew louder, and one of the candles flared unnaturally high, its flame bending as if obeying their voices. Elias reached instinctively for his revolver, though he knew bullets would not silence words older than gunpowder. Then suddenly, all 3 women turned toward the window at once, their eyes locked on his. He had not made a sound, but they knew he was there. Clara's smile stretched across her face, not cruel but certain, as if she had been expecting him all along. Elias stumbled back from the window, heart hammering, unsure if he had already crossed a threshold that could never be uncrossed. And as he mounted his horse, a single thought consumed him. If the sisters had seen him, then they had marked him. The ride back to town was a blur of dust and pounding hooves. Sheriff Elias Morrow's mind refused rest, repeating the image of 3 faces illuminated in unnatural firelight, their gazes converging on him like a noose tightening. He had thought himself the hunter, the watcher, but now he knew. He was the quarry. By dawn, he stood at the threshold of his office, hands trembling as he reached for the key. He forced himself to breathe, forced himself to recall every detail. The cloth on the table, the chants, the candle flame, bending as though alive, all evidence of a ritual, yet without proof, they remained shadows. Shadows did not convict in court. Still, Elias felt something invisible pressing against him, as if the sisters had carried part of their circle into his very bones. Later that day, Clara Whitfield found him hunched over his desk. Her voice broke his trance. "You look like you've seen the dead." Elias almost told her the truth, but instinct held him back. Instead, he shared only part of it, the feeling of being watched, the sense of deliberate malice. Clara listened, her brow furrowed, then whispered, "If they marked you, Sheriff, it means they've chosen you. And once chosen, the desert never lets go." The words clung to him like burrs. Chosen, marked. He wondered if the sisters had pulled his name into their chants, if some unseen ledger now bore it. That night, another disappearance rocked the town. Samuel Miller, a traveling salesman, had been last spotted heading toward the desert road. His wagon was found overturned near the ravine, goods scattered, no trace of his body. But there was a mark scorched into the sand, a perfect circle with 3 intersecting lines at its center. Elias stood over it as the moonlight cast pale shadows, feeling certain it was no accident of wind or weather. The mid-hook came swiftly. Ignacio Torres, the herder, swore he had heard Samuel's voice echoing through the night after he vanished. "It wasn't screaming," Ignacio insisted, eyes wide. "It was calling, like he wanted me to come closer. But I knew it wasn't really him, Sheriff. It was them. They were using his voice." Elias could no longer deny it. These women had power, power that bled into the land, twisting sound and shadow alike. He felt the walls closing in around him, his rational mind grappling with something that refused to fit within law or science. He wrote in his private journal, "They are not merely killers. They are keepers of something older, something that does not die." Driven by desperation, Elias returned to Mrs. Callahan, the midwife. Her hands trembled when he described the circle burned into the earth. "They've opened a gate," she muttered. "Once opened, it cannot be easily closed. Sheriff, you must understand. They are not hiding anymore. They are inviting." Elias understood too well. He had not stumbled upon them by accident. They wanted him to see, to feel, to know. And worse, they wanted him to spread that knowledge, to infect the town with fear. Fear itself was a kind of offering. He returned home that night, but sleep evaded him. Every creak of wood, every whisper of wind against the shutters felt like their presence, pressing closer. When dawn finally broke, he found something scratched into his front door. 3 lines intersecting in a circle drawn in dried blood. He stared at it, pulse hammering, realizing the truth with a clarity that nearly broke him. The sisters were not merely watching him from afar. They had entered his life, his home, his mind. The mark on the door was a promise, and promises made in blood were never easily broken. Sheriff Elias Morrow stood frozen before the mark on his door, the circle carved in blood like a seal, like a brand. He felt the weight of it more than he saw it, as if the sisters' presence had seeped into his bones during the night and left this reminder for all to see. A man could dismiss shadows, dismiss whispers, even dismiss the sound of voices in the wind. But blood on a door was not imagination, it was intent. His first thought was to scrape it away, to erase their claim. Yet as his hand reached for the handle of his knife, he felt the chill of hesitation. What if erasing it invited something worse? The sisters did not act without purpose. If they had marked him, then the mark itself might be part of their ritual. Removing it might mean defying whatever pact they believed was already sealed. The sheriff's fear shifted into something sharper, anger. He was a man sworn to uphold law, not to bow to superstition. And yet, he admitted to himself, superstition had a way of taking shape when enough blood stained the sand. That morning, townsfolk began to whisper of strange disturbances. A blacksmith's daughter claimed she saw 3 women walking along the desert ridge just before dawn, their gowns untouched by dust, their hair moving through the air had been still. A rancher swore his cattle had stampeded at night. No predator in sight, only the sound of singing carried on the wind. Elias wrote down each account in his journal, adding them to the pattern that stretched tighter and tighter around the sisters' names. The midhook struck when Clara Whitfield returned to his office with something clutched in her hand. It was a book, its leather cover cracked, its pages filled with dense script written in a language Elias did not recognize. "It was left on the schoolhouse steps," Clara said, her voice shaking. "No note, no messenger, just this." As Elias opened the book, he felt an unease ripple through him. The script twisted before his eyes, but among the foreign words were sketches, circles with 3 intersecting lines, figures standing hand in hand, and symbols that matched the mark on his door. The book was a guide, perhaps even a manual, but left for whom? For him or for them? Clara's face drained of color as she whispered, "They want you to read it." Elias slammed the book shut, resisting the pull of the pages. "Or they want me to lose myself inside it," he muttered. That night, as the desert grew still, Elias took his horse and rode once more toward the house. He told himself he needed answers, but another truth tugged beneath his denial. He was being drawn there, pulled like a moth toward the flame of something he could not yet name. The sisters' home glowed with candlelight when he arrived, though no smoke rose from the chimney. He tethered his horse and moved closer, pressing himself against the wall beneath the window. Inside, he heard laughter, not the laughter of joy, but the laughter of certainty, as though his arrival had been expected. Through the crack in the shutter, he saw them again. This time, the cloth on the table had been removed, and what lay beneath made his stomach turn. It was Samuel Miller, the missing salesman, his body pale, his chest marked with the same circle etched into the sand. His lips moved faintly, but no sound came. It was as if his voice had been stolen, trapped, or redirected elsewhere. Elias staggered back, bile rising in his throat. He understood then. The sisters were not merely taking lives. They were harvesting something unseen, something vital, twisting it into their rituals to anchor themselves against time. A sudden creak snapped his attention. The front door opened with deliberate slowness. Clara Kavanaugh stepped out, her eyes fixed on him in the dark. She smiled, her voice carrying across the still air. "Sheriff, you can watch, or you can join, but you cannot ignore us anymore." Elias backed toward his horse, revolver in hand, but her words followed him like chains he could not break. For once he realized the truth. He had already crossed their threshold and there was no way back. Elias rode hard through the desert night, but the thought clung to him like a burr, that by seeing too much, by hearing too much, he had stepped into their world. The sheriff who once believed in reason, evidence, and the rule of law now found himself unraveling before 3 women who bent time itself. Every hoofbeat of his horse seemed to echo the rhythm of their chanting, a sound he could not unhear. When he finally reached town, the streets were empty, but windows flickered with lantern light. The townsfolk were already whispering of the missing salesman, of shadows moving near the ridge, of voices carried on the night wind. Elias wanted to tell them the truth, to shout it through the streets, but his oath held him back. Panic would not serve justice, and yet silence might doom them all. The next morning, Elias returned to his office to find something waiting on his desk. a small bundle of dried flowers tied with red thread, and tucked beneath it, a slip of parchment bearing a single line written in immaculate script. "You are part of us now." The handwriting was steady, deliberate, neither rushed nor afraid. He burned it in his stove, but the smell lingered long after the ash was gone. The midhook came when he received word from Dr. Keats, who had examined the cattle carcasses found on a nearby ranch. "It wasn't wolves," Keats insisted. "The bodies were drained, completely, not a drop left inside. I've never seen anything like it, Elias, not in beast or man." The doctor's hands shook as he spoke. "It's not killing for food. It's killing for something else." Patterns were emerging with cruel clarity. Ritual circles burned into the ground, bodies emptied yet left intact, voices stolen as if woven into the desert air. Elias had studied enough crime scenes to recognize calculation. This was not frenzy, it was method. Clara Whitfield came to him again, this time with her jaw set hard. No longer the frightened schoolteacher, but a woman prepared to confront darkness. She confessed that her grandmother's stories told of such methods, not just survival rituals, but a systematic hunger. "Each act prepares the next," Clara said. "Small sacrifices build into larger ones. The sisters are not finished with animals or drifters, Sheriff. They are escalating, and soon they will want someone close, someone the town will notice." Her words sent a cold shiver through him. Already his door had been marked. Already they had fixed their gaze on him. If escalation was inevitable, then perhaps he himself was the next link in their chain. That night, unable to sleep, Elias walked the empty main street of town. He noticed lights burning in several homes, townsfolk awake, restless, uneasy. The desert had begun to creep into their lives, not with sand, but with fear. It was then that he understood. The sisters' truest weapon was not just ritual, but psychology. They seeded doubt, stirred whispers, made fear itself a currency. And the more the town feared, the stronger the sisters became. Determined to break the cycle, Elias began to profile them as he would any outlaw. Clara, the calculated leader, steady, the one who spoke with authority. Maeve, the watcher, her silence sharper than words, her eyes dissecting every weakness. Eleanor, the youngest, yet the most unpredictable, her nervous hands always twisting fabric as though to mask deeper intent. Together they formed a perfect triad, alone, perhaps vulnerable. But they were never alone. Elias closed his journal with a final line that chilled him as he wrote it. They are building toward something greater, and the town itself may be the sacrifice. At dawn, a scream tore through the streets. A boy had vanished from his bed, his mother swearing she saw 3 shadows pass her window just before the candle blew out. In the dirt outside their home, Elias found the circle again, 3 lines intersecting at its center. His worst fear had come true. The sisters were no longer targeting strangers. They had turned their hunger towards the town itself. And now Elias knew, with dreadful certainty, the sisters had declared war, and the town was their altar. The boy's disappearance shattered any remaining illusion that this was a matter of chance. Elias stood among the townsfolk as the mother's wails filled the morning air, his badge heavy against his chest. He had sworn to protect these people, yet now he found himself helpless against something that slithered beyond law or bullet. Fear ran like fever through the crowd. Every whisper became accusation, every shadow a threat. The sisters had succeeded in what Elias dreaded most. They had turned the entire town into a theater of dread. He ordered the streets cleared and gathered a few men he trusted to search the ravine. Tracks led partway across the sand, but vanished near the familiar circle, scorched into the earth. There was no blood this time, no sign of struggle. Only that eternal mark, 3 lines meeting in perfect symmetry. To Elias, it looked less like writing and more like a lock. And if a lock, then somewhere it had a key. The midhook arrived in the form of an unexpected visitor. Clara Kavanaugh herself walked into his office just after sundown. She entered as though she owned the place, her gown unmarked by dust despite the miles of desert behind her. Elias reached for his revolver instinctively, but she raised her hands, her expression serene. "You waste your strength in fear, Sheriff," she said softly. "The boy is not lost. He is chosen. Do not confuse the two." Elias's jaw tightened. "Where is he?" Clara tilted her head, her smile a blade sheathed in silk. "Safe. Safer than he's ever been. We do not take, we preserve. We do what the world fears most. We hold back time. Tell me, Sheriff, if you could keep this town from aging, from dying, would you call it murder? Or mercy?" Her words crawled under his skin, testing his convictions, probing for cracks. Elias steadied himself. "You drain lives to keep your own. Don't dress theft as mercy." Clara's smile faded. "Then you already know too much, and knowledge, Sheriff, is a debt. You cannot carry it forever." She left without another word, but the silence she carried with her was worse than any threat. Elias sat for hours after, staring at the chair where she had sat, feeling as though her presence still lingered like perfume. He decided to test them. The next evening he left false evidence near the ravine, scraps of cloth torn from his own coat, stained with pig's blood, hidden in the rocks. He waited. The desert grew silent, the kind of silence that devours thought. Then, near midnight, he saw them. 3 figures gliding across the sand, their steps leaving no trace. Maeve, the silent one, crouched over the cloth. She touched the blood and smiled faintly, as though recalling a private memory. Then she whispered something Elias could not hear. The others nodded, and together they drew another circle in the sand. When they vanished into the darkness, Elias approached the mark. His heart pounded. Inside the circle lay the cloth he had planted, but it was no longer stained. The blood had been drawn out, leaving the fabric pale as bone. He wrote in his journal with shaking hands. They knew it was false, and yet they used it. They do not need truth to feed. They only need the intention of it. This revelation turned everything upside down. The sisters were not bound to the literal spilling of blood. They thrived on symbols, offerings, fear itself. By planting false evidence, Elias had unwittingly given them exactly what they wanted: acknowledgement, a token of his own intent. As he closed the journal, a knock sounded at his door. When he opened it, no one stood there. Only another bundle of dried flowers lay at his feet, tied with red thread. And beneath it, written on parchment in the same steady hand, "Sheriff, you've begun playing our game. Now let's see how far you're willing to go." Elias stared into the night, dread clawing at his chest. They weren't just haunting the desert anymore. They were inside his choices, twisting his every move. And as he realized this, Elias understood with horror. The sisters were not merely hunting him, they were teaching him. The thought stalked him through sleepless nights and restless days, winding around his mind like a serpent. Elias had spent his life studying patterns of crime, drawing order from chaos, yet now he was part of the pattern itself. Every move he made seemed anticipated, manipulated, as though the sisters were shaping him into something he did not want to become. He returned to the ravine once more, determined to prove to himself that he still had control. But what he found there stripped him of certainty. Hidden in a hollow beneath the rocks was a small chest, weathered but intact. The iron latch warm to the touch, as though it had been waiting for him. Inside lay a collection of objects that froze his blood. Strips of clothing, a locket engraved with initials, a pocket knife etched with the name of a missing ranch hand. These were not trophies left carelessly. They were records cataloged meticulously. But at the bottom of the chest was something worse, a book of diagrams. Elias opened it with trembling hands, and his eyes fell upon sketches that detailed progression, from animals to men to children and beyond. Notes written in a hand he could not mistake as anything but deliberate, charted the yield of each sacrifice, the strength retained, the years purchased. It was not madness, it was arithmetic. The sisters had been building toward something vast, something systematic. The midhook came in the form of a chilling discovery, scrawled in the margin of one page. The town will be enough to carry us through the century. Elias slammed the book shut, his heart pounding. This was no longer about scattered disappearances. It was a plan, a deliberate design to consume the town itself. That night, Elias shared his findings with Clara Whitfield. Her face went pale as she ran her fingers across the sketches. "This isn't superstition," she whispered. "It's calculation. They're treating life like currency." Elias nodded grimly. "And the town is their bank." The teacher's courage hardened. "Then we cannot wait for them to act. We have to move first. Show the people what they've hidden. Force them into the open." But Elias hesitated. He had seen how fear strengthened the sisters. If the town erupted into panic, would it feed them further? The book in his hands was proof, yet proof alone was a double-edged blade. That evening he returned to his office to find another message waiting, pressed against his desk like a silent taunt. A folded sheet of parchment bearing the words, "You read what we left for you. Good. Now you see the beauty in the design." Elias crushed the paper in his fist, rage mixing with dread. Were the diagrams planted deliberately? Had he truly discovered their secret, or had they fed him exactly what they wanted him to believe? His training told him to question every piece of evidence. His instincts told him the sisters were not careless. They anticipated his discovery. For the first time, doubt gnawed at him more than fear. What if exposing the book to the town played directly into their hands? What if he had been guided step by step toward an action that would ensure their victory? Late that night, as he wrestled with these thoughts, Elias heard a sound outside his window, a soft humming, melodic, unmistakably female. He drew his revolver and moved to the glass. In the moonlight, he saw Eleanor, the youngest, standing at the edge of his yard. She was humming a lullaby, her eyes locked on his. But when he rushed outside, the yard was empty. Only the faint echo of the tune lingered, winding through the night like a promise and a threat entwined. Elias stood beneath the stars, clutching the revolver, realizing with a shuddering clarity that the line between hunter and prey had already blurred. He was caught inside their web, and the more he struggled, the tighter it closed. And deep in his bones, Elias knew the sisters were not only showing him their methods, they were grooming him to replace them. The thought sat like poison in his chest, making every breath heavier. Elias had hunted outlaws, tracked killers, buried friends, but nothing in his years of service had prepared him for this. The notion that the enemy did not merely wish to destroy him, but to remake him, to turn him from lawman into heir. At dawn, he rode to Dr. Keats with the book of diagrams pressed tight beneath his coat. He needed validation, some external voice to ground him. Keats flipped through the pages in silence, his spectacles trembling on his nose. "These calculations," he whispered. "Elias, this isn't madness. This is structure. Whoever wrote this had knowledge of anatomy, cycles of the body, and, God help me, mathematics. This isn't just ritual, it's science wrapped in superstition." Elias's stomach tightened. He had wanted Keats to dismiss it as hysteria, but the confirmation only deepened the pit. "So it could be real," he muttered. "Real enough," Keats answered grimly, "that if you show this to the council, they'll either panic or laugh you out of office. Neither outcome saves the town." The midhook came when Clara Whitfield entered the room unbidden, pale and determined. She had something clutched in her hands, a child's shoe, caked with desert dust. "I found this outside the church," she whispered. "It's from the boy they took. They're not hiding it anymore, Elias. They want us to see." Her words confirmed the dreadful rhythm he'd begun to suspect. The sisters were not simply predators in the shadows. They were performers staging a ritual for an unwilling audience. Each sign, each offering, each stolen life was not concealed, but displayed. Fear was not a side effect. It was the core ingredient. That night, Elias tried to rally the town council in secret. He laid the diagrams on the table, spoke of the missing boy, the marks scorched into the sand. But instead of unity, he found division. Some accused him of chasing phantoms, of losing his mind. Others whispered that confronting the sisters might only invite ruin faster. In the end, no plan was agreed upon. The meeting dissolved in frightened mutters and shaking heads. As the council dispersed, Elias caught sight of something chilling. At the back of the hall, unnoticed by the rest, Maeve Kavanaugh stood in the doorway, silent, her eyes fixed on him. She had not interrupted, had not spoken, had not even moved. Yet her presence alone was enough to unravel the fragile courage of every man in the room. By the time Elias pushed through the crowd to confront her, the doorway was empty. That night, alone in his office, Elias opened his journal and forced his trembling hand to write, "They are not merely haunting this town, they are shaping it. Fear is their altar and we are their congregation." But the twist came when he found another slip of parchment tucked between the journal's pages. He had not placed it there. In the same delicate script as before, it read, "You lead well, Sheriff. Soon they will follow you into the circle themselves." Elias' blood ran cold. Were the sisters predicting his downfall or orchestrating it? Each failure to unite the town, each word he spoke, each action he took seemed to play into their unseen design. He no longer knew where his choices ended and their influence began. When dawn broke, a new horror awaited him. The boy's mother stumbled into the square, her eyes wide with terror. "He came home," she gasped, "but he isn't him. He speaks in whispers." 3 voices at once. The crowd fell silent, dread thick as smoke. Elias pushed through, and there the child stood. His face was pale, his smile too serene, and when he spoke, Elias heard it, the harmony of 3 voices echoing like the sisters' laughter, carried inside his throat. And in that instant, Elias knew the truth. The sisters had breached the walls of the town itself, and the battle was no longer outside. It was already within. The boys' whispering voices echoed in Elias's skull long after the crowd had dispersed. Mothers clutched their children tighter, men crossed themselves though they had never set foot in a church, and the streets of town fell into a silence that felt more like surrender than safety. Elias stood rooted in the square, watching the boys' strange, too calm, smile as if it were a signal flare announcing that the old order had ended. He wanted to protect the town, to shield it from the sisters' reach, but how could he fight an enemy that no longer needed the desert to stalk its prey? The boy's body was back, but his voice, his very essence, was not his own. Elias had read of possession in dusty archives, but this was something worse. Not an invasion, but an integration. 3 voices threaded together, yet steady, like a choir stitched into a single throat. That night, Clara Whitfield came to his office, her face pale but her voice firm. "Sheriff, you cannot fight this alone anymore. They've made their move on a child. Do you understand what that means? They're no longer content to take drifters and nameless men. They want to shatter the heart of this town. And if they succeed, they will not stop with us." Elias stared at her across the dim light of his desk. The diagram spread between them like a battlefield map. "You think I don't know that?" he snapped, then softened at the sight of her trembling hands. "But if I strike too openly, the town might crumble before the sisters even touch them. Fear is already winning. The midhook arrived with a revelation Clara had kept hidden until now. She pulled a small, worn journal from her satchel, its pages brittle with age. "This belonged to my grandmother," she said. "She wasn't just telling stories, she was keeping records. She knew of the sisters, or women like them. She wrote of a counter-ritual, a way to bind their circle, but it requires a willing sacrifice, someone they've marked, someone they've chosen." The air went still. Elias's eyes locked on hers. "You mean me?" Clara did not flinch. "They've already named you, Sheriff. Every mark they've left, every game they've played, it all points to you. They're preparing you to step inside their circle. That may be the only way to close it." The words cut deep. Elias had suspected he was their target, but hearing it laid bare sent a cold certainty through him. He had been walking their path all along, whether by choice or by design. The council offered no help. Most had retreated into their homes, whispering prayers into locked rooms. But a few brave souls, Clara among them, Dr. Keats with trembling hands, and Ignacio Torres with his steady rifle, gathered in the sheriff's office to plan. They would not wait for the sisters to strike again. They would take the fight to the desert house. Elias outlined their grim strategy. They would enter the house, confront the sisters directly, and if the counter-ritual could be enacted, he would be the one to bear its weight. None of them argued. They knew the truth. Only he had been prepared, groomed, chosen. Yet as the night deepened and their plan took shape, Elias felt the sisters' presence pressing in. At one point, the lamp flickered and a soft laugh echoed through the rafters. 3 voices at once, chillingly familiar. Ignacio swore and gripped his rifle tighter. Keats nearly fled. Clara only whispered, "They know." And Elias, staring into the flame of the lamp, realized something darker still. Perhaps the sisters wanted this confrontation. Perhaps they had orchestrated it from the start. When the meeting ended, Elias walked Clara home. The streets were silent, but he could not shake the feeling of eyes watching from every shadow. At her door, Clara gripped his arm, her voice low and urgent. "Promise me you'll remember, Sheriff. The ritual only binds if the sacrifice is willing. If your will falters, we all fall." Elias nodded, though his throat was dry as sand. As he turned to leave, he saw it again. The circle scratched into the dust at his feet, fresh, unbroken. And in that circle, drawn at Clara's very doorstep, Elias read the sisters' warning, "Your allies will not save you." The message struck deeper than any weapon. Elias had faced ambushes, duels, and men desperate enough to kill for scraps of gold, but none of them had looked him in the eye without being present. The sisters did not need to be there. Their symbols carried their voice, and the voice was always stronger than the steel he wore on his hip. The following morning, Clara found him seated at his desk, his revolver stripped and polished, though they both knew bullets were no answer. Her eyes fell on the journal open before him. Written in Elias's steady hand was a confession of sorts, a record of every strange occurrence, every missing soul, every mark burned into the desert. But among the facts, Clara saw something else, his doubts, his fear that by fighting the sisters, he had already stepped into the very role they had carved for him. "You can't let them write your ending," Clara said quietly. Elias looked up, weary but resolute. "They've been writing it since the first man vanished. I'm just catching up." The midhook came when Dr. Keats burst into the office, sweat clinging to his brow. He carried a bundle wrapped in cloth. With trembling hands, he revealed its contents, a series of bones, animal at first glance, but marked with carvings that spiraled like vines. "I found them near the boy's house," Keats stammered. "They've been placed deliberately like wards or instructions, each one etched with the same 3 lines. Sheriff, this isn't just ritual anymore. This is preparation." Elias studied the bones with a heavy silence. The sisters were escalating, building towards something precise. The book of diagrams had already suggested it, but now he saw it confirmed. The sisters were not feeding blindly. They were crafting. The boy, the symbols, the offerings. It was a sequence, each act preparing for the next. That night, Elias returned to the ravine with Ignacio at his side. They moved cautiously, torches low, rifles ready. Beneath a cluster of rocks, they discovered what Elias had dreaded most, a hidden chamber dug into the desert itself. Inside, by the flicker of their torches, they found shelves lined with jars. Some held strange powders, others thick liquids that shimmered unnaturally, and on one shelf sat a row of human teeth, arranged like trophies. Elias's stomach turned, but it was Ignacio who spoke first. "This isn't just memory, this is inventory." Elias forced himself deeper into the chamber. At the back wall, nailed like a grotesque mural, were pages torn from the book he had studied, pages he did not remember missing. Each one described a stage of the ritual, culminating in a final act labeled only as the renewal. He reached for the last page, but as his fingers brushed it, the torches flickered. A voice echoed through the chamber, not from outside, but from within the walls themselves. 3 voices braided into one. "You read what you were meant to read. You follow where we allow. Sheriff, every step you take is ours." Ignacio dropped his torch, panic rising. Elias gritted his teeth, dragging his ally out into the open air before the darkness swallowed them whole. Back in town, Elias recorded every detail, but the weight of his notes pressed on him with unbearable clarity. He no longer wondered if the sisters were manipulating him. He knew it. Each clue, each discovery, even this hidden chamber, all had been placed for him to find. They were teaching him, preparing him, molding him like clay in their hands. That night, he sat alone in his office, staring at the revolver beside him. He thought of Clara's words, of Keats's trembling fear, of Ignacio's wide eyes, and a dreadful thought clawed its way into his mind. Perhaps the sisters were right. Perhaps knowledge itself was a debt, one he could never repay except by stepping willingly into their circle. For the first time, Elias admitted to himself a truth he could not bear. He was no longer certain he was fighting them. He might already be becoming them. The admission weighed heavier than his badge, heavier than any crime he had ever pursued. Elias Morrow, sworn keeper of law, now stood on the boundary of something darker than law could measure. Every instinct told him that hesitation was death, yet his own hands trembled at the thought of what he might already carry within him. The sisters had marked him, manipulated him, molded him. If they meant for him to join them, then each discovery he believed his own might only have been another step in their design. That night he could not escape the sense of being watched. The desert wind pressed against his windows like whispers. Shadows moved in the corners of the room, though no lamp flickered. He gripped his revolver, but it was not a man he expected to face. It was himself. What if their voices already stirred in the back of his mind, waiting for the moment to speak? The mid-hook struck when a knock rattled his door, steady and deliberate. He opened it to find a package on the step, bound in red thread. Inside lay a mirror, its frame ornate but cracked. On the glass, written in a finger's smear of ash, were the words, "Sheriff, look closely. Do you see us, or do you see you?" He hurled the mirror against the wall, shards scattering like frozen echoes. But one fragment landed face up on his desk. In it, his reflection appeared not as a solitary man, but as 3 faint silhouettes hovering behind him. Elias staggered back, clutching his head. The sisters had crossed another threshold. They were not just in the town, not just in the boy's voice. They were in him. In desperation, he turned to Clara Whitfield once more. She listened without flinching, though her face carried the same haunted exhaustion as his. "They're pushing you to a choice," she said. "Either you resist and lose yourself to fear, or you accept and risk becoming what they want." Elias's voice cracked. "And if I accept, Clara? If I step into that circle willingly?" Her silence was more terrifying than any answer. Finally, she whispered, "Then you may not come back, but it might be the only way to end this." The council had abandoned him. The town had retreated into silence. Only Clara, Ignacio, and Dr. Keats remained at his side. Together they prepared for what Elias dreaded would be the final confrontation. They gathered salt, old prayers, fragments of the grandmother's journal, and rifles that felt like relics in the face of eternity. On the eve of their planned strike, Elias sat alone in his office. His journal lay open before him, blank page waiting. He dipped the pen and wrote words he never thought his own hand would form. "If this is to be my fate, let it be by my choice, not theirs." The twist came when the lamps flickered out, and 3 figures stood in the doorway without sound or footstep. The sisters, radiant in the lamplight's death, their faces ageless, their eyes gleaming with the serenity of inevitability. Clara, Maeve, and Eleanor, together as always. Clara Kavanaugh spoke first, her voice soft as velvet yet sharp as iron. "You've fought well, Sheriff. You've carried our lessons with stubborn grace. Now it is time to decide. Will you resist and perish, or will you join and live beyond the years?" Elias's hand hovered over his revolver, but in the silence that followed he realized the weapon was meaningless. This was no duel of bullets. It was a duel of will. The sisters extended their hands, waiting. Behind him, he felt the weight of his allies' hope, but before him, he saw the inevitability of their circle. And in that moment, Elias understood the horror. He was no longer their hunter, no longer their prey. He was their chosen successor. The realization did not strike like lightning. It sank like a stone. Elias felt the weight of inevitability pressing on his chest as the sisters extended their hands, their gazes steady, almost tender, as if welcoming him into a family. Long estranged, for a heartbeat, he wondered what it might feel like to accept, to surrender the endless fear, to step into a circle that promised power, knowledge, and a release from time itself. But then the image of the boy returned to him, 3 voices speaking through one fragile throat. That was the future they offered, a future where he would no longer belong to himself. Elias gritted his teeth and tore his gaze away from the sisters' hands. "You've mistaken me," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. "I don't succeed you, I end you." For the first time, their faces changed. Clara's serene mask hardened, Maeve's eyes narrowed with fury, and Eleanor's nervous hands stilled completely. The room chilled, as though the desert night itself had entered with them. The mid-hook erupted when Ignacio and Clara Whitfield burst through the back door, rifles raised. A shout rang out, a gunshot cracked, and the fragile stillness shattered. Bullets tore through the air, striking nothing but shadows. The sisters moved like water, their forms flickering in and out of the lamplight. Eleanor's voice rose into a piercing cry that made the lamps explode, glass scattering in the dark. Elias wrestled with his own mind as much as the chaos around him. Each step he took toward them felt weighted by invisible chains, tugging him closer to acceptance. He heard their voices inside his skull, not spoken aloud but whispered from the marrow of his bones. "Join us. We have already chosen you. You are already ours." Dr. Keats, trembling but resolute, shouted a prayer he half remembered from childhood. He threw a ring of salt across the floor, and for a fleeting moment the sisters recoiled, their outlines rippling. Elias seized the chance, drawing the grandmother's journal from his coat. The page describing the binding ritual fluttered open as if the book itself had been waiting for this moment. "Sheriff!" Clara Whitfield's voice cut through the din. "Now, it has to be you." Elias stepped into the circle of salt, clutching the journal, and began to read the words scrawled in his grandmother's hand. They tasted bitter on his tongue, foreign yet familiar, as if carved into his memory long before he spoke them. The sisters shrieked, the walls trembling, the floorboards groaning. Yet with each line he felt the noose around his soul tighten. This was no act of resistance, it was a surrender of self. The twist came when he realized the truth, too late. The ritual did not destroy them, it tethered them. Each word bound them not into nothingness, but into him. His body shook, his vision blurred, and in the wavering candlelight he saw their forms blur and melt, merging into shadows that seeped beneath his skin. He fell to his knees, gasping as Ignacio rushed forward to steady him. But Elias shoved him back, his voice trembling with something not wholly his own. "Stay away." Clara Whitfield's face blanched. "Elias, what have you done?" He rose slowly, his body heavy, his mind aflame with voices. He heard them clearly now, not outside, not in whispers, but inside, woven into the marrow of his bones. The sisters had not been ended, they had been absorbed, and as the dust settled, Elias stood in the ruined office, his allies staring at him with horror, realizing that the lawman they had followed into battle was no longer just Elias Morrow. For though he still wore his badge, the sisters now lived within him, and their circle had only grown stronger. The days that followed blurred into a haze of unease. Elias Morrow walked the streets of the town with the same deliberate stride, the same cold eyes, the same badge gleaming against his chest. But those who met his gaze swore there was something else behind it, something watching from beneath the surface. Children hid behind their mothers when he passed. Men who once tipped their hats now crossed to the far side of the street. Dr. Keats insisted Elias be placed under confinement, and the council, shaken by what they had seen in the shattered office, agreed. They did not call it an arrest. They called it a protective measure. Elias allowed them to escort him to the abandoned rectory at the edge of town, where the thick stone walls could serve as a barrier, though against what, none could say. From the outside, it appeared he was contained, but within those walls, the sisters whispered ceaselessly. They spoke to him in unison, their words winding through his mind like roots splitting stone. "You fought us, Sheriff. You resisted, but resistance shapes the strongest vessels. You are ours, and we are you." At times, Elias could still hear his own voice, his own conscience clawing for air. But more often, he felt himself watching from the margins of his own mind, a guest within his own skull. He began to mimic their movements without meaning to, his hands twisting fabric the way Eleanor once did, his head tilting at odd angles like Maeve. When he smiled, it was Clara's smile, serene and certain, not his own. The midhook came one night when Clara Whitfield dared visit him in the rectory. She pressed her hand against the bars of the cell and whispered, "Elias, are you still in there?" His reply was steady, his voice familiar, yet not. "Part of me." Then he leaned closer, his eyes glinting in the dim light. "But part of me is more than me now." Clara's face broke, torn between grief and resolve. "You can't let them win. My grandmother's journal said their power only lasts if they remain together. If you can break their bond, separate them, you can weaken them." Elias laughed, low and hollow. "And how do you separate voices that sing through your own throat?" Yet after she left, something stirred within him. The journal's words echoed in his fractured mind. Break the bond. Was there still a sliver of choice left? Could he turn their own binding against them? In the rectory, incidents began to mount. Guards swore they heard women's laughter echoing through the halls, though no women entered. A fire sparked in the chapel without cause. flames dancing in the shape of 3 figures before vanishing. One night, a guard awoke to find Elias standing at his bedside, silent, eyes open but unblinking, as if sleepwalking under another's command. The council grew uneasy, but Elias's confinement became a double-edged blade. The sisters' influence seeped beyond the walls, incidents of accidents rising in town. A well collapsing on a rancher, a sudden stampede at the stockyard, a child found murmuring in 3 voices before dawn. The town began to whisper that keeping Elias alive meant keeping the sisters alive too. And then came the discovery. Hidden beneath the floorboards of the rectory, Ignacio unearthed a small leather journal, not of Elias's making but the sisters'. Pages filled with coded entries, notes on rituals performed, and symbols even darker than those Elias had found before. At the final page, written in a hand that seemed to shimmer with ink darker than black, were the words, "The vessel is ready. The renewal begins soon." And as Elias stared at those words, he realized with a crushing dread, the sisters' plan was never to consume him alone. They intended to consume the entire town through him. The weight of it nearly broke him. In the dim light of the rectory, the leather journal shook in his hands, its pages humming like a living thing. He saw the pattern clearly now. Every vanished traveler, every stolen voice, every ritual circle drawn into sand and blood. They had not been random acts of hunger. They were rehearsals, preparations for something larger. He was to be the vessel, but the town was to be the feast. Outside, the world bore proof of their tightening grip. Cattle turned up in fields with their hides unbroken, but their eyes vacant, as though life itself had been siphoned away. Children whispered lullabies in 3-part harmony without ever having learned the words. Fires bloomed in homes without spark or tinder, leaving only circles of soot upon the walls. The town had become a mirror of the sisters' will, and Elias stood at its center. Clara Whitfield returned once more, though Ignacio warned her not to. She pressed through the guards and sat opposite Elias, her eyes fierce with defiance. "If they mean to use you," she said, "then we must break their chain before the renewal begins." She opened her grandmother's journal to a page Elias had not seen before, one scrawled in code and marginalia. It says the bond can be severed if their voices are divided, if their unity is broken. You have their voices inside you. If you can force one to speak against the others, the circle shatters. Elias felt the sisters stirring at her words, their whispers sharpening in his skull. "Do not listen. Do not betray us. We are you now." He clutched his head, gasping, "And if I can't?" Clara's eyes softened. "Then the town dies, Sheriff, all of us. You must try." The mid-hook came when Dr. Keats arrived with another revelation. Among the coded entries in the sisters' journal was a list of names, every missing person marked with dates and symbols. But at the bottom of the list were names not yet gone. Children, elders, townsfolk who still lived. It was not a record, it was a ledger, a schedule of sacrifices to come. And the next name written there chilled them all, Clara Whitfield. That night the rectory was stormed by terror. Guards screamed as unseen hands dragged them into shadows. The walls shuddered with laughter, and the locked door to Elias's chamber blew inward as though struck by a storm. The sisters stood framed in moonlight, their beauty unblemished, their smiles unbroken. Clara reached for Elias through the bars, shouting, "Now, fight them!" Elias rose, every nerve ablaze with the clash of voices. He felt the sisters inside him, their whispers threading his will, urging surrender. Yet Clara's cry anchored him. With trembling force, he shouted aloud, "Maeve!" The name tore from him like a wound. For a heartbeat, silence. Then Eleanor's voice shrieked inside him, "You betray us!" Maeve's form flickered, her outline trembling as if her place in the triad had faltered. The sisters staggered, their perfect unity breaking for the first time. Elias pressed harder, calling each name in turn, forcing the voices to clash, to overlap, to fracture. Their harmony broke into discord, the sound tearing through the rectory like thunder. But victory was not absolute. The sisters screamed, and with one final surge of power, they vanished into shadow, leaving the rectory in ruins. Elias collapsed, his breath ragged, his mind split between triumph and terror. Dr. Keats rushed forward, but Clara held him back. She stared at Elias with dread. "It isn't over," she whispered. "You drove them out, but not all the way. They're still inside him, waiting." And as Elias raised his head, his eyes glinted with a light not wholly his own, and the voices whispered softly, "The renewal has only been delayed." And though the rectory still stood, Clara knew the sisters had not been defeated. They had only changed the shape of their prison. The town wanted to believe it was over. The rectory, with its scorched walls and broken windows, stood as proof of a battle fought. But Clara Whitfield, Ignacio, and Dr. Keats carried a silence heavier than victory. They had seen Elias's eyes. They had heard the whisper in his breath. The sisters had not died. They had burrowed deeper. Elias himself became the greatest question. He walked free at the council's request, for they could not imprison their sheriff forever without cause. Yet every step he took seemed uncertain, as if each footfall belonged half to him, half to someone else. He resumed his duties with mechanical precision, yet when he spoke, his words often lingered just too long, as though weighed by 3 unseen voices before leaving his lips. Children stopped playing in the streets when he passed. Dogs whined and hid. Even the desert seemed to hush when his shadow stretched across the sand. Elias did not acknowledge it, but he felt it. In the stillness of night, when he closed his eyes, he no longer dreamed his own dreams. He dreamed theirs. The midhook arrived with the first accident after the rectory. A fire consumed the blacksmith's barn, leaving behind no embers, only a perfect circle etched into the dirt. A week later, the pastor's wife fell ill, her body drained of strength, though no doctor could name the sickness. At her bedside, she murmured in a voice not her own, "Sheriff." Whispers spread. Some townsfolk began to call Elias cursed. Others began to call him chosen, both names cut like knives. Clara sought him one final time, her hands gripping the worn journal that had guided them. "You can still fight them," she urged. "They feed on unity, but you can starve them with solitude. Leave this town, bury yourself in silence. Do not let them spread through you." Elias met her eyes with a weariness that bordered on resignation. "And if leaving isn't enough? If they already are me?" His voice trembled, and in that tremble, Clara heard not one man but 3 women speaking in chorus. The final twist came the next dawn. Elias was gone. His badge lay on his desk, polished, gleaming, untouched by dust. No horse had been taken, no tracks marked the sand. He had simply vanished. Yet in the weeks that followed, stories trickled in from far-off towns, of strangers disappearing, of children singing in voices not their own, of circles drawn in blood across lonely doorsteps. Always a lawman was said to pass through just before. The town of Arizona fell quiet, wrapped in a silence that was not peace, but dread. Clara Whitfield kept the journal hidden, Ignacio kept his rifle near, and Dr. Keats drank himself into forgetfulness. None spoke Elias's name aloud. To do so felt like an invitation. And so the desert house remained, its shutters painted, its garden green against the barren land, waiting as it had always waited. For time did not move there, not in the way it did for the rest of the world. And somewhere, whether in the desert or beyond it, Elias Morrow walked on, not fully himself, not fully theirs, but something in between. The events surrounding Sheriff Elias Morrow and the Blood Sisters of Arizona remain unresolved. a wound in history left open. Did he become their vessel, carrying their circle into new towns? Or did he resist from within, holding them at bay at the cost of his own soul? Some truths are too heavy for record books, too dangerous for sermons, too strange for law. Perhaps what happened was not an ending, but a continuation, one that still bleeds through forgotten roads and silent houses. And so we leave you with the question, when evil does not die but only changes its shape, how do we recognize it before it takes root again? Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe so you don't miss the next story, because sometimes the shadows of the past are still walking among us.